We have a special offer for Follow the Money listeners on Richard Dennis's new book, Big, The Role of the State in the Modern Economy. Despite decades of rhetoric to the contrary, Richard points out that taxes and government spending don't ruin the economy, they just reshape it. For 20% off Big, The Role of the State in the Modern Economy, just head to publishing.monash.edu, select Big and enter the discount code OzInstitute20. That discount code again is AUS Institute 20 when you check out Big at publishing.monash.edu. Buy your copy of Big today.
People might think that it's politically unrealistic to get fossil fuel companies who have a lot of influence to actually pay a disaster levy. But the point is that if we don't, every one of us is going to be paying huge increasing costs ongoing. So it's really important that we start extracting a bit of money from these big global companies who are fueling these problems.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and we had some technical difficulties with my audio today. So for most of this episode, you'll hear me as recorded on Zoom. Apologies if the sound quality isn't up to our usual standard.
Thousands of homes are underwater tonight as a flood disaster wreaks a terrible toll.
Lismore authorities and volunteers are battling chaotic and unpredictable conditions with hundreds of dramatic rescues playing out. Thousands of residents were evacuated overnight.
Outrage over the flood crisis response is growing this morning.
We've got turbocharged extreme weather events because of climate change. They're a fact of life now.
As climate change increases the frequency of natural disasters, homeowners are getting hit with soaring insurance premiums. Banks have warned insurance might soon be unaffordable.
And we're not seeing the changes actually occurring that need to change, that need to occur.
It should be a given in a country that we live in. You know, the level of support should be almost immediate, but you sort of almost feel like you're begging.
Given the awful recent flooding along the east coast of Australia, today we're going to be talking about the cost of climate-fuelled disasters. We all know that natural disasters are expensive. People lose their houses, their cars, their businesses, their livelihoods, including their cattle in some cases, their possessions, and sometimes tragically and awfully, they lose their lives. Disaster recovery costs are already enormous, and they're likely to get bigger as global temperatures rise and cause more frequent and intense extreme weather events. So to talk about these costs and how we're going to pay for them, I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Ogue, Principal Advisor at the Australia Institute. G'day, Mark.
Hi, Ebony.
Mark, we've all seen the devastation brought by the floods in places like Lismore, Byron, Ballina and southeast Queensland in the last couple of weeks. What's the damage bill for these floods likely to be, do you think?
Yeah, it's very hard to know at this stage, but if we look at previous floods, the Queensland floods in 2011 alone cost over $14 billion. And these floods are unprecedented, and they're more and they're wider because they encompass northern New South Wales as well. So we're looking at, I'd say, well north of $14 billion.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of money, isn't it? And seems like the recovery is going to take a long time as well. As you've said, you know, there were recent floods only a few years back. We had the Black Summer bushfires. Australia does have a lot of extreme weather, even before you account for climate change. How much are climate-fueled disasters expected to cost Australia? I guess, how much are they costing now, and what's that cost going to look like in future?
Well, it's interesting. Just a few years ago in 2017, Deloitte Access Economics did a study to look at the total costs of disasters in Australia, and they found they estimated then that disasters were costing around $18 billion a year and was expected to rise to $39 billion a year by 2050. But that assumed that or at least one of the differences in that analysis was that they assumed that disasters would occur with the same frequency and intensity as they have in the past. So now they've updated that study and they've found that rather than being $18 billion a year, currently they're around $38 billion a year currently, and expected to rise to up to $94 billion a year by 2060 in a high emission scenario, which is the trajectory we're on at the moment.
That's enough for half a dozen nuclear submarines. Mark. I mean, that's extraordinary though, isn't it? So
it's more than the JobKeeper program cost every year, and rising.
And they were estimating at the time that cost kind of wouldn't be our annual cost for decades away, but that's the scenario where we're already living in. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I think people need to realise, I don't think it's really sunk into for people just yet, but because climate change makes climate-related disasters more frequent and more intense, and people kind of recognise that it's getting worse, but they think this is the new normal. This isn't the new normal. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse every year, and it's going to get catastrophic unless we reduce emissions really quickly.
So we can avoid the worst of it, but there's already some baked in, and we're already seeing that the intensity and frequency, I mean, just with the floods alone, it wasn't that long ago that the Brisbane floods were happening. Lismore, I think their last floods were only in 2017. I guess we can already see that.
Lismore knows floods, but this is more devastating than ever.
The report has scientifically linked more storms, floods, droughts, heat waves and other extreme weather events to global warming.
Climate change isn't lurking around the corner waiting to pounce. It's already upon us.
Climate change was making these disasters worse, or as the latest report from the IPCC last month found, more frequent, intense and extreme.
We've talked about some of these costs, Mark. Obviously, people are losing their homes, their cars. I saw one bit of awful footage of a farmer who was just watching half his cattle float away in the floodwaters. I mean, what are some of the costs that end up as a result of these huge catastrophic extreme weather events?
Yeah, there's just a whole range of costs. So if you start at the beginning, there's all the costs around emergency response. So, for instance, the Prime Minister was saying just this week, I think that, you can't expect to have, emergency services resources available.
But in any natural disaster, everyone has a role to play. And the suggestion that it is only the governments that are involved in an emergency response, I don't think the community agrees with that, by the way, and they certainly...
Well, you can't if you don't put a whole lot more money into it, because we need much, much more in terms of emergency services now. Once you actually have the disaster, you've got the initial relief. People need relief to cope with the immediate wash up, if you like, when they're homeless and their businesses can't operate, and
crisis accommodation.
Yeah, exactly.
Food relief.
And then you get on to the recovery and reconstruction. So you need to support people through the recovery, and then you need to put money into infrastructure, and that will include public infrastructure like roads and rail and port and telecommunications, all of those kinds of things. But it's also reconstruction for private property, businesses and households. And then on top of that, you have the costs of if you like, the economic and social costs, which include the disruption to people's lives, and but also the health and particularly the mental health costs. And Deloitte Access Economics estimates that that's equivalent to pretty much all of the other material costs again.
Yeah. And Mark, how much does insurance cover when we have a disaster?
It's really hard to know what the breakdown of insured to uninsured costs are, but there's likely to be more uninsured costs than there are insured costs. But I think the really important thing for people to understand is that in the end, it's not the insurance companies who are paying those costs. It's you and I paying those costs either through, basically through higher premiums, or potentially now through our taxpayers' money going into a reinsurance pool to underwrite some of these increasing risks.
Yeah, so tell us about that reinsurance pool, because that's quite a big pot of money, isn't it?
Yeah.
Why do we need it?
Well, the problem is that in some of these areas, particularly in northern Australia, these disasters are becoming so frequent that insurance companies don't want to insure some of these areas, or they will insure them, but the costs are becoming prohibitive for people. So the government has floated the idea or proposed the idea, it's actually in draft legislation at the moment, but proposed the idea that the government underwrites the cost of insurance to the tune of around $10 billion. So they'll stand behind the insurers to cover those costs if they have to. But in the end, that's taxpayers. It's really just shifting the cost from the insurance from insured people to taxpayers.
From roads and bridges to water and sewer systems, a huge amount of public infrastructure has been damaged or washed away, leaving local councils with a monumental bill and a huge rebuilding task.
Where people already were living in floodplains that didn't have insurance, how are they going to rebuild? It's the poor people that live in what we call affordable housing in the most sensitive and vulnerable areas because of climate change.
So ultimately, Mark, it's the public who's ending up paying for a lot of these costs. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, people don't realise that ordinary households and businesses, ordinary Australian households and businesses pay pretty much the entire cost of disasters. So if it's government funding, it's ultimately paid for through your taxes or the loss of services that we would have otherwise because, government resources are finite, or it's through higher insurance premiums, or it's through people just directly suffering the impacts through loss to, injury or illness or loss to their property, or through higher prices. We're seeing higher prices flow through because when you flood huge areas of farmland and roads and that kind of thing, prices go up as well.
All these natural disasters are kind of becoming more intense and more frequent because of climate change. And ultimately, it's gas and coal and oil companies that are fueling that with their emissions. How much are they contributing to the costs of these disasters?
Well, the primary cause of climate change is through fossil fuel emissions, through coal and gas, and the companies that cause these are largely big global companies that operate all over the world, and we let them extract our resources and export them in Australia. And we've done some research around what the emissions are resulting from coal and gas in Australia being dug up and exported by these companies or used in Australia. And currently, Australian coal and gas adds around 1.5 billion tonnes of emissions to the atmosphere, and there's projects under development in Australia that would add a further 1.7 billion tonnes of emissions to the atmosphere every year if they go ahead.
So they're definitely contributing to the problem, and are they helping pay for the problems they're causing, for the damage?
No, they're the main cause of the problem, and yet they contribute virtually nothing to the damage they cause, which is outrageous because it's a fundamental principle of economics that companies that cause damage should pay for that damage. It shouldn't be passed on to other people who aren't causing the damage, and really you have a market failure if that's happening. I mean, that's all kind of economic jargon for saying it's incredibly inequitable and unfair.
Yeah, they should be cleaning up their mess effectively. And Mark, the Australia Institute has been proposing a national climate disaster levy. Why is that? Why do we need that?
Well, the fundamental point is that if we keep doing what we're doing now, ordinary Australian households and businesses will pay 100% pretty much of the costs of disasters going forward. And that is, as described, as we were describing before, enormous and growing forever. So really we need to shift that cost to the companies that are causing it, because if we don't, we'll pay. And so what we're proposing is a levy on the embodied carbon in every tonne of coal and gas that's exported from Australia. And depending on what that levy is, it varies how much money it would raise. So, for instance, if it was a $1 a tonne levy, we'd raise about $1.5 billion a year. If it was a $10 a tonne levy, we'd raise about $15 billion a year. And if it was a $20 a tonne levy, we'd raise around $30 billion a year. So, you put that in the context of the $38 billion it's costing a year for Australia in natural disasters. We need to start thinking about how much what kind of a levy we need to put on fossil fuel production.
The fossil fuel industry is causing harm. They should pay for dealing with the crisis.
The Minerals Council of Australia has rejected the call, saying the best way to reduce emissions is to adopt new technology, not by introducing new taxes.
So they're not really paying any contributions at the moment. We got rid of the carbon price, so they're not paying anything in those terms. But I know a lot of people kind of worry that if we put a levy on gas and coal and that type of thing, that it would push energy prices up. Would that be the case?
No, this doesn't affect energy prices at all. A carbon price does affect energy prices because you're putting the price on energy used within Australia, but this is a levy on fossil fuels that are being exported, so they're not being used in Australia, so they can't push up energy prices in Australia at all.
And how big are our exports?
Huge. We export around 450 million tonnes of coal every year and around 70 million tonnes of LNG. So they're vast. We're the world's biggest coal exporter and the world's biggest liquefied natural gas exporter.
So fair bit of scope there for, them kicking in a few bits of change to help with climate disaster levies, fair to say.
They make billions and billions of dollars every year. And I should say, I kind of spoke before because I said we're the biggest exporters. We're not the biggest exporters. These are global multinational companies by and large who we license to extract our resources. And on top of the fact that they don't pay for any of the damage that they're causing, they also pay very little tax in Australia. Hardly any of them pay any resource rent tax, which is the tax specifically on resources extracted in Australia, and most of them don't pay any company tax either. So essentially, we're largely giving away these resources away for free. So they're making huge profits and not giving us anything in return, or not giving us much in return, and causing all this damage which they're not paying for.
Mm.
And just also one other thing for context, you've got to think also about the cost of every tonne of carbon. So there's a thing called the social cost of carbon, and that's an estimate of the cost of the damage caused per tonne of carbon we put up into the atmosphere. The US government uses a figure of $90 a tonne of the social cost of carbon, and there's other estimates that it's as high as around $800 a tonne in terms of damage. So there's huge scope for levying these companies to make a contribution to the damage that they're causing.
And so what we're dealing with here is an extraordinary event. Australia is becoming a harder country to live in because of these natural disasters.
Longer term, we need to be looking at how we rebuild our communities, making sure that they're safer, making sure that we're mitigating against future floods, future fires and droughts too. The government's got a $4.8 billion fund that it set up 3 disaster seasons ago that it hasn't touched. It's gained $800 million as it's been sitting there untouched and unused when we could have been building flood levies, building culverts, building better drainage.
And again, if we just come back to these communities who end up being affected by climate disasters, whether that's storms or cyclones or floods or bushfires, you know, they do take an enormous toll and in many cases take many, many years to recover from, but they're happening more and more frequently. So it's urgent that we kind of get organised for this because, as you said, you know, this isn't the new normal. Things are going to keep getting worse unless we reduce our emissions.
Absolutely. The costs are already huge and they're getting bigger and bigger. And if they don't pay, we will. And there's the added issue that because we're getting more and more of these disasters, you get a kind of a combined effect. And so there's not the resources for things like rebuilding. So, for instance, people are still waiting for their homes to be rebuilt after the bushfires because there's not enough tradies, you know, builders and tradespeople available. And then on top of that, you get the floods, you know, and so you get this kind of compounding disaster effect. So unless we get a serious infusion of resources from a source other than our own pockets, we're all going to be in pretty serious trouble.
Yeah, I mean, it was just awful to see like how many houses just in Lismore alone were affected and how many people are homeless there. And as you said, there's not enough time to recover from one disaster before the next one hits. It's pretty diabolical. But the other thing I was going to ask about is the other thing that was extraordinary and that I think has caused a fair bit of outrage in the community, Mark, was the fact that it really was the community, effectively government outsourced even rescue to the community. There wasn't enough resources for the SES, who do an amazing job, but who are also largely volunteers at the end of the day. The ADF wasn't on the ground for many, many days afterwards. Like there's huge scope still to be able to improve our disaster response as well, isn't there?
Yeah, look, I think this is interesting because it really reflects the attitude of many in the government who have been very slow to actually accept climate change. So if you don't accept that, or if you're resistant to accepting that climate change is real or really acknowledging the full extent of the problems it's causing, then of course you're not going to take the steps that you need to be prepared for these kinds of disasters. And that's absolutely the case with the current government, because despite all of this and despite having access to the best scientific information and being briefed and all the information around the world, Australia has no coherent climate adaptation plan, and we haven't even done a risk assessment on the impacts of climate change. And that's extraordinary, and I think that reflects the resistance to actually, you know, acknowledging that it's a problem or acknowledging the scale of the problem.
Yeah, I just thought it was extraordinary that communities were kind of crowdfunding their own helicopter rescue, in 2022 in Australia. It just seems unbelievable to me that that's the situation that we find ourselves in now.
Are you embarrassed that ordinary Australians are having to do so much work in this? Ordinary Australians are having to get themselves to remote areas in their dinghies, wading through floodwaters to help people, to take them food and to make sure they're all right.
No, Koshy, I mean, that's the Australian spirit. That's what you and I would do for our neighbours. And
absolutely.
It's what people do
we
in
want
extremis.
the ADF to do that for us as well.
I'm not
Dozens of these sort of GoFundMe pages have emerged over the last week in New South Wales and Queensland, with even the Defence Minister, Peter Dutton, launching one to support the Pines River community.
What's going on with your colleague Peter Dutton setting up this GoFundMe page for his local community in Brisbane, asking people there to contribute to disaster recovery?
That sounds to me like someone doing their job. So I commend Peter for what he's doing. I don't understand the criticism of it, frankly. I really don't.
Yeah, it's almost comically emblematic of this attitude that some Conservative politicians have to government, where they think government shouldn't be involved, and you rely on charity or your neighbours to help out, which is just absurd and a complete abrogation of responsibility when it comes to natural disasters. I mean, it is at any time, but when it comes to natural disasters of this scale, only a government can provide helicopters, SES, large-scale emergency response and relief and reconstruction. It's silly to think that you can sort of have a GoFundMe page, as a substitute for just the government stepping in, taking a leadership role and providing the resources. It's just worth stating again that people might think that it's politically unrealistic to get fossil fuel companies who have a lot of influence to actually pay a disaster levy. But the point is that if we don't, every one of us is going to be paying huge increasing costs ongoing. So it's really important that we start extracting a bit of money from these big global companies who are fueling these problems.
Well, we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Mark Ogue. This episode was recorded on Tuesday the 15th of March 2022, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a _N_T, and Mark Ogue is at Mark Ogue. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macy, and you can find her at Jennifer Macy, with additional editing by Louise Osborne. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Don't forget to leave us a review if you enjoy the podcast, as it helps other people to find us. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.